Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here, share with you some of the current reality about pharma and innovation, particularly to drive benefit to patients and reducing cost. So let me just say that today I'm going to share with you some of the challenges pharma is facing, and some of them and the criticism, maybe they brought it upon themselves, and some they beyond their control, and they try to address it. So we want all have known that in the past decades, pharma and the noble profession and try to help patients and so on, but the image start being declining, and now they're regarded as among the chemical and petroleum industry, and people only see them as they care about profits, and they think really all what they do just to get the most out of patients, and as this cartoon depicted. But actually, as I said, I'm going to share with you today some of the criticism and challenges where pharma has been facing, and we're going to touch on few things. Some of these including, actually, people think that pharmaceutical company prevent generics. They don't want any generic company because that will reduce the price. And we're going to talk about bringing drug from Canada or from other country, reimportation. So there are so many things. Some of them are really not facts, and we're going to talk about that, and that all of these where pharma look upon in these, that these are enormous criticism faced with enormous challenges. Of course, we all know that the pharma business is really, it's a business doing noble profession to treat diseases. So the challenges they are facing are centered around their fewer drugs and their, of course, less revenue, because in order to discover drug, you have to spend a lot of money over 15, 17 years to bring drug to market. So with the generic and with fewer drugs, then the money you spend on developing drugs is not going to be recuperated in a few years left for the patents. So today's lecture, and I'm going to share with you 3 themes or 4 themes about the challenges, how pharma can continue to innovate, and in the meantime, they can bring new drugs for new diseases and unmet medical needs. So far, we don't have any treatment for Alzheimer's disease or pancreatic cancer or others. Then we're going to talk about what pharma does in order to improve the process and bring drugs to market. Then we talk about the challenge, particularly in generic. And I'm going to say with you, people ask, well, when I go to the pharmacy and I get generic, is that as good as the brand name? And my answer to them is not always. I'm going to share with you that, and we talk about also the new, actually, now or the future generation for personalized medicine. And then we talk about what pharma is doing to improve their pipeline by changing their business model. So that's where we're going to touch base today. And whatever you're going to get drug, whether the drug is vaccine or pills you take or injectable protein, all these drugs are belong to those 3 platforms. And you can get all the diseases, you can have therapy, or you have vaccine or protein. Somebody, when you look at the slides, say, there's something missing on that slide. Where is the antibiotic? So yes, indeed, what's missing on that slides, the absence of antibiotic. The antibiotic discovery and coming to market has been declining in the last 20 plus years or so, while the bacterial resistance and hospital infection has been increasing. People, when they go and make an operation in the hospital, they survive the operation, but they die from the infection. And this is well documented, that large number of acquired hospital infection and so on. Why is that? Somebody will ask, why is that? Well, go back in the history and check your Google back in the year 2000. The year 2000 was the critical year where the FDA changed how they can approve new antibiotic. Usually to approve any drug, you take the drug and you have placebo, and the drug works, then you compare it with comparator. It worked like comparator, they get approved, except an antibiotic. They changed that in 2000, and they have to be passing a higher bar in being maybe 10 times than the comparator and so on. Then you see in the news, Pfizer cancer infectious disease, Lilly cancer infectious, and so on. So until recently, the FDA tried now to encourage the development of antibiotic, and they have this GAIN initiative where it's called Generating Antibiotic Incentive Now. So if you're going to develop antibiotic, you're going to get more patent life, because when you get the patents issued, it's issued for 20 years. Then you develop the drug for 15, 17 years. You have only 3 years left to recuperate the money you spent for R&D. So now you can get the extra 5 to do that, and the FDA promised fast track for antibiotic. So that actually will be helpful for the company to bring along with other drugs. Well, whether you are in pharma or in School of Pharmacy, Drug Discovery Center, or in academia, the recipe is the same. When you discover a drug to treat a disease, you want to know really what's involved in the disease. Many of you have friends and patients and relatives or so, they are depressed. Why they are depressed? Because there are certain chemicals in the brain, lower level. They are really reduced. So for me, as a medicinal chemist and a pharma scientist, I will make a drug, take these chemicals up in the brain. And that's where you have in drugs like Effexor and other, they call reuptake inhibitor, where they increase serotonin and norepinephrine. What we mean by those starting points, that you want to look for your target. And that target could be chemicals, could be protein, like sometimes it's a gene. Then you take that and you identify some which can modulate on that target. And that's why you find high throughput screening has been now the common theme in pharma. You can screen thousands, hundreds of thousands to get the starting points. Then for us as a scientist, we take the starting points and all the way to make it into drug. This gives me an example of the disease is the lock, and then you have a key, and I am as a scientist, I will make that key fit the lock to open the lock, and that's actually how we discover drugs. Let me say to you that people may think the process is simple, and there are so many drugs on the market. Actually, when you look since the FDA being formed in 1938, there's not too many drugs discovered. It's less than 1,500. And these drugs mainly are small molecules or chemicals, tablets, and so on. And the majority of these are for different diseases. Some injectable, about 15%, where they are for other diseases and cancer. But when I gave you an example of targets, people may think there are so many targets where we can discover drug. Actually, all these drugs in the market for less than 400 targets. So we were hoping with the human genome that now we have so many targets. We know our body has over 30, 40,000 genes. So that could give us maybe 5,000 targets where we can develop drug, which is probably true, but you have to correlate that target to the disease. And that's what we call the target validation. And that's where most pharma fail in doing their research. The process of getting this drug to market is involved. It's a long process. And when you talk about discovery, people working on the preclinical and so on, it's just the first box there called discovery. But you have to go through the development, clinical trial, phase 1, phase 2, and all these take a lot of effort and a lot of money, and you get a lot of failure rate as you go in the process. Many of these will fail. So when we start with thousands of starting points, molecules, then you're going to go into handful to go to man. Then if you are lucky, one of the drug will come to patient for treatment of disease. So the process is long and it's costly. And some people may say, since I started my career back in 1982, to bring drug to market, was really about $350 million. Now it's surpassing 1.5 billion. And people will say, that's not true. Well, here is the statistic. You can look at the rapid increase in the cost of R&D to bring drug to market from the 140 million in the 70 to close to 2 billions now. When you look at this price, imagine, I know you just mentioned that you go into shows and cruises and all this. Well, you know that this price, what you can do with that, you can buy 3 cruises or 6 Airbuses to bring one drug to market. So just to give you, imagine how the cost of bringing drug to market. And then when you bring it to market, only 2 out of 10 drug, you can recuperate that money you spent. And the rest, this is really, that's why the cost of drugs are high. So these are one of the major challenges, and pharma's been dealing with that. And you can put this in another term. If you look at the phases here from doing discovery, you spend a little bit of money. Then when you move it into human, you spend much, much more, and so on. And imagine with what I mentioned to you, that you won't have much to recuperate. So if you are a pharma executive, you say, we're going to go through all this process, guys. If the drug is not going to make it to patient, can we just cancel it in the beginning? And that's what you call, if you're going to fail, fail early and fail cheaply. So in order to, all of us as a scientist, we have in our mind how we can put the best foot forward to ensure successes. And to do that, then pharma realized we're going to deal with the hurdles of the regulatory and the FDA and the safety and all this. But at least when we come up into this phase, we want to make sure that the drug is not going to fail. So we did some analysis before. Why drug fail and does not reach the patient? And believe it or not, here is the major reason for drug failing. And you will be surprised when someone sees the major reason is physical chemical properties, which indeed it is, or used to be several decades. Why is that? Well, if the drug does not have the right properties and you treat a brain disease, if your drug cannot come to the brain and cross the blood-brain barrier, that drug is worthless. If you treat a cancer patient and the drug cannot penetrate the tumor cell, that drug is worthless. So that's why we relate to the physicochemical process. Of course, the safety and efficacy, this is only translated in the clinic. So pharma came about and they realized, well, here is the attrition, and we realized in this data presented. So what we can do, we can actually reduce the failure rate by addressing the physicochemical properties. All medicinal chemists in pharma back in the late 90s or so, they dedicated themselves that they're going to develop molecules and they know that have the right physical chemical properties, and that's why the reason failure for that is almost eliminated and non-existent. So from the old days, when we discovered drugs like the Effexor and so on, we make as many drugs and put them in human, and then one of them will be lucky, make it to market. Nowadays it's changed. You can put your best drug ahead of you first, and that means the drug fully characterized, the drug already good properties, and good animal testing and so on. So that's will reduce the attrition rate. So for me as a scientist, I really don't have just to make things in the lab. I have to juggle so many things. The novelty, the properties, and all these things in order for me to make sure that the drug reaches the disease target and the drug will succeed. So what we do when we do our discovery, we do parallel track. We work on having the structure-activity relationship, which we call it the SAR, but also structure-properties relationship. We go through the process for the structure activity by doing some tests and so on to make sure the drug will work in animal. In the meantime, in parallel, we have ensemble of assay. We tell you that the drug is water soluble, the drug will be decomposed by the liver enzyme, and we have a list of assays we do to make sure that when we put it in man, the drug is not going to decompose and the drug will last to produce its effect. Because what we want it at the end of the day, when you give the drug to a human, this is a foreign substance. So the drug will force the human biology to give you the therapeutic index. But in the meantime, the body want to fight the drug. They want to get rid of it. They want to decompose it. That's what you call the pharmacokinetics. So, and this barrier, when the drug goes in the body, there is so many barriers. The liver, it has microsomal. Then you have the so many other things, clearance. And then the drug, the protein will catch your drugs. So all these are the barriers where we try to overcome. So because it's very easy for us as a scientist to make you something in the lab, in the tube, very potent ligand. And that's not a drug. So I can give you nanomolar in few weeks, or can give you something which is very soluble in few weeks. But the trick here to combine them together so you can have your drug candidate, which is potent, physical chemical properties, will reach the disease target. And that's where we all try today to do our drug discovery. Another things we can do as a scientist, if we can show what we do in the lab can translate into the patient bedside. And that's what we call translational research or translational medicine, where we try to take the experimental things in the lab and in the animals, and then we take these into the clinic so we make sure that this drug will work. But that also helps you in reducing costs, because if I'm treating inflammation and then I have something early, then when I try in phase 1 and I look at the fluid in your knee and I see that the enzyme is inhibited, then I make sure when I spend the money for phase 2, phase 3, I already saw in phase 1 that the biomarker is working. And that's actually another things to improve the attrition. Let me take you to a challenge. So the challenge of increasing success rate is being addressed, and the attrition rate. So how about the challenge about the patent expiration? And this is another thing facing pharma. I mentioned to you you don't have forever to make money on your drug, and that's what we call the patent cliff. So just in the last 10, 15 years, there is almost 30 drugs known as blockbuster, Lipitor, and all these major drugs. Their patent is expired, and then the company losing a lot of revenue. So that means you're looking there for people, insurance company, say, why should I pay for these drugs when it's already, there are generic and so on. And then the government, they facilitate having the generic coming out and reward companies to actually produce generic. So this is another things where pharma's facing what we call the patent cliff, that you have only short period of time to recover your expenses. I'll give you an example here. I mentioned the depression. You're all familiar with the drug Prozac. This drug Prozac, when it came generic, in less than 3 years, they lost 90% of the revenue. And that shows you same thing for more recent drug like Lipitor. The sales used to be $12 billion. Just in a year or so, the sales dropped to less than $2 billion. So these actually are generic impact on the company, what really they do. Because here in the US, we encourage generic. You know, when you go to your drugstore and you give him your prescription, he's not going to ask you, especially in Pennsylvania. He will change it into generic unless you tell him, I want it brand name. So people will come and ask, well, how come? I said, well, generic now become popular. In the old days, 50% of the drugs were generic. But now, believe it or not, every 10 prescription, 9 of them are generic. And that's really one thing people have to keep in mind. And you're going to see that over the next few years, a lot of billions of dollars will go into generic. Then one would ask the question, so that's not bad. And instead of paying so much money, 200, I'll pay like 20 or 30 or so. Then I say, yes, you're right. So, but the question here is the generic drug is as effective as the brand name. And as I gave you the answer, not always. And I'll share with you a few examples. I will say, first ask me, what is generic? I say, well, look at the FDA. What the FDA say, well, the drug has to be bioequivalent to the brand name. At least it reached to 85 to 125 exposure in the bloodstream. Then you say, okay, did the FDA require anything else? I say, no. And I know that we have colleagues here from the USP for the excipients and so on. I said, so the non-active ingredients, did the FDA say has to be this one? And I say, no. So that means if you have another ingredients, which really you may develop allergy to it. Some actually children do that. Then you ask another things, what happened if you treat a disease where there is narrow therapeutic index? What I mean by that, people who take drug for blood clots or for epilepsy. I go to the pharmacist and I said, give me prescription. He gave me generic, which will give me 85% in bloodstream. It's a generic approved. Then the next time he gave me another generic, which is 125% reach your bloodstream. That means you take huge dose for these narrow therapeutic index disease where you really need the doses to be very controlled. This is the disease I listed, epilepsy, for blood clottings and all of the other. So these some factors you need to keep in mind and when you go with your generic or so on. The other things we say, well, even the FDA, they banned some of the generic, and this happened back for the drug antidepressant, which was actually butyrone back in the year 2012, because they found that the active ingredient is less than the drug was in Wellbutrin. So that drug was banned. Then also the FDA came for some developing country particularly, not much here in the US, and they said the anti-infective antibacterial, if it's not have the exact material or the exact concentration, then you're going to develop a lot of sort of bacterial resistance. And I can see this overseas in some countries and so on. So you keep that in mind. Of course, these are some subtle things between the difference. But the most important things I would regard why the innovative drug and the brand name is important and the drug reimportation, because the adulteration. We're all familiar with cases where we saw what happened for children drugs in India many years ago, where the glycerol used was industrial grade, which was have above 18% of the lethal dose, and there 15 or so children died. We're all familiar with the heparin fiasco a few years ago, where heparin was tainted with sulfate chondroitin and so on, came from China, and that actually caused a lot of death in that time, and there was a huge event because the FDA learned their lesson. When you put the guidelines, and that's why there's guideline by USP and others, people have to look carefully to this guideline. For heparin, they have guideline is the sulfur content. That was in the old days. Of course, if I'm somebody who's smart, say, oh, sulfur, let's put chondroitin sulfate, we'll raise the sulfur, we'll reach what the FDA, and that was actually marketed, and then people died from that because then that changes some of the regulatory condition. So that's why I'm sharing with you a few things with some of the challenges and what's the pros and cons for these challenges. Let me take you to something which is really going to be the wave of the future. And I would refer to that as personalized medicine with the diagnostic. But many people are still skeptical about diagnostic and personalized medicine because in the old days, how people get medicine? We said, okay, they look at observation of your condition, and then they prescribe something for you, and if it works, that's a success. So that's really the, I don't want to call it trial and error, but with personalized medicine, you're going to get precise or optimum medicine based on your, actually, your genetic components and so on. So that's where the flashy things about personalized medicine, people said you're going to get good diagnosis, and then you're going to get not really one drug fits all, the drug which really suits you. So what really the outcome of that? The outcome is great. If you look at it as an insurance company or patient, or, well, we're going to save life, yes, but more importantly for insurance, we're going to save money. So rather than, so that's the thing where the hallmark of personalized medicine, and one has to understand, when you ask me, why this, we didn't have it many years ago? Well, because of the science, we really came a long way with what we call the omic science, where the proteomics and genomics and all that, and in particular for us in drug industry, and as we know, back in the year 2000, it's been highly publicized. The human genome was being ciphered, and we know all the genes we related to diseases and so on. So then people smart, they went and get diagnostic kits and so on, and then now the physician can work with the patient and they can prescribe the medicine. Very important to know, for us as a human being, our bodies formed from genes. So if your gene, there is malfunction in your genes, because these genes lead to proteins, then there will be malfunction in protein, then that means you're going to get disease. So that's really the hallmark and the foundation of personalized medicine. And as I said, that take cancer, for example, because personalized medicine now is really highly sort of progressing with the cancer diseases more than any other disease. Then changes in the gene can lead to some cancer, and it depends on gene mutation in a family. And I gave you here an example of just single nucleotide, which I can highlight it for you here. You can see everything is the same. It's just one base pair changed from cytosine, guanosine to adenine, thymine. That actually mutation can cause disease. So that's give you the, where we found a few years ago, and especially for women, we say BRCA1 gene, if you have changes in that, there is a good chance you're going to have breast cancer. And then what happened in the year 2013, the diagnostic people reported for BRCA1 gene skyrocketed. And people will ask, wow, why the people was looking for this BRCA1? And if anybody know the answer here, will be great. Did anybody know why that many women went to look for their BRCA1 gene? Of course, the answer is here. It was Angelina Jolie, which most of you know, that she actually, because of her family, they have history with BRCA1 gene, then she actually took the very drastic approach doing the double mastectomy, but not too many people do that because there are options. But that's actually raised the level when she went public, and it was, if you remember the news and so on. So that actually tied in with how this genetic diagnostic with the disease and personalized medicine. Of course, for cancer, there are several options. People can do chemotherapy, can do surgery, and they, with their physician, they decide, and mostly, almost 50%, they receive chemotherapy, and they can measure between this efficacy, safety, and so on. But let me just say that this cancer thing, there's a lot of progress has been made, and it's tremendous, actually, on the health insurance and on the patient and so on. But there are some cases for cancer where really there was survival rate for the leukemia and so were really very low. Now it's really survival rate is really is very high up and so on. So let me take you with that, with maybe, I don't want to be negative, but I say, okay, that's great what you're saying, Magid, for us, that we'll go get the test and get the drug. I said, not too fast. I mean, here's the things where you want to know there are some challenges. We're looking for the test. you need to make sure how your good sample going to be taken, which lab you're going to do, and then when you get the data, it's, believe it or not, it's sometimes different from one lab to another, and so on. And then one would ask, say, do you want to tell me there will be false positive? I say, yeah, it's like anything in life there is. So let's give you an example here with another gene, which is HER2/neu, where we know that also for women who get positive in that gene, they can develop breast cancer. And then that's why the company formed this antibody Herceptin, where almost 50% of the women responds to that. So then the diagnostic company went and came with Herceptin testing, and that's great. So we say, now we're going to get the test and we do this. Yes, the current reality with that test, which you read the fine print, they say it has 18% false positive. So when you look at Roche, who make the Herceptin, they said they sold it for over 1.2 million patients. So one will go back with the 18% say, so that means like 200,000 women, they really didn't need that. But that's really part of the equation where you keep in mind with the coming with the personalized medicine. Then now let's look at the money. Who's going to pay for personalized medicine? People say, should the insurance company or... So there was big opinion leaders and statistic done, and then the two opinions say, 1/3 said the insurance company should not pay for that because it's actually, they want to keep the price down and we don't want to, but then they get the majority say, well, look at the cost benefit. They really should pay for that, and they do all this. So all these things is still actually under debate, and insurance company, believe me, is not going to pay. If some of you are diabetic or family member, if you get a prescription for some of the drug for prescription, the pharmacist automatically will change it to metformin because metformin is dirt cheap. And there are other medication, and this medication, when you ask the pharmacist, why you did not give me this drug, he said, your insurance company does not cover it. So I asked the pharmacist, I said, what do you mean? He said, you know what 1 month's supply cost with that drug? I said, no. He said, $5,000. But when you get the metformin, 1 month's supply is less than 200. So that's one of the things you need to keep in mind with the cost. Who's going to pay for this cost? I mentioned the test, and I mentioned this for you about the challenges, but there are other challenges, of course, like a business. Well, when you do this, can you patent the genes? No, you can't, because all this natural gene, you can patent them, only the synthetic gene. Then we talked about the reimbursement policy, and more important, some people try to collect the data, so you can see, as I mentioned, the BRCA one with the cancer or this. Then you're going to get into the patient privacy. So many people don't want to have these things about the family history and so on. So there are a lot of challenges going on, but the future is coming if we can overcome some of the fears where, of course, for the insurance, where they think is paying too much, you look for the physician who's getting headache now with all the testing, and then the patient now where they said they don't want to give me the drug, which is good for me. And then, of course, the most major thing with the regulator and also diagnostic company. The insurance with the pharma will look at it. If I'm going to treat drug, make drug for this gene, how many population of that? I'm going to lose my market. So there is a lot of also challenges with the pharmaceutical company that they can buy into research, focus, and personalized medicine. So we hoping that the personalized medicine will be here, and in the meantime, if you compare that with the trial and error and the current therapy where it's skyrocketing, personalized medicine, there will be some spending for diagnostic in the beginning. But once that diagnostic is there, you're going to receive the improved healthcare and the optimum therapy, and it's going to be much lower than actually the traditional therapy, which we know is going to be coming. Let me take you to the last part of my presentation about, with all these challenges, how pharma dealing with that. And then pharma's dealing with that in so many ways. They're looking now at their revenue. So they said, you know what? Most of what's happening now, FDA is very hard to get drugs out. So especially in many areas like cardiovascular and other. But there are some area is much easy. So if you look at all the big pharma, you can take it to the bank. They all work for drug for cancer. Why is that? Because FDA regulations say, if you prolong the patient life by 2 or 3 months, your drug is approved. So that means I can work in cancer and take some of the early clinical trial from maybe leukemia and other things. So now it go into biologic. So the pharma decided that we should improve our portfolio by having some of the biologic in that, because biologic also is going to sell, and there is no generic, at least in the last few years and so on. And that's one of the things we're talking about, pharma action. We talked about attrition, now we talk about biologic. You see a tremendous increase in the number of biologic is being discovered and sold. And I put some here on the slide for you. So that's what pharma, when I left the company, we used to have our portfolio 80% small molecules, chemical tablets and so on, and about 20% biologic. And the senior executive were hoping in the next decade we'll have 50-50 and we increase in the biologic. So that shows you how pharma has been really committed to having more biologics because they know they don't have to worry about generic soons and so on. So that brings me, because the situation has changed, the generic and biologic, which is called biosimilar, and FDA is still struggling with the approval of biosimilar. They put the things for the generic, which we talked about, that the 85 to 120% and so on. For biologic, they give you there, they have to be highly similar, they have to be no clinical different, they have to be complying with all the characteristics of the original drugs and so on. So that's why, same as I gave you the example in diabetes, FDA for diabetes, I mentioned the metformin. Believe it or not, metformin was sold in Europe for 1950, only in the US here after 20, 25 years. So they really come behind with some resistance. Same for biosimilar. The biosimilar started in the UK and others early on. Here in the US, the first biosimilar came just a couple of years ago from Novartis, and then they followed up with another biosimilar. So biosimilar, there are about 30 plus in Europe, and here in the US, maybe 5 or 6, with many of them under development. So this is another area where the FDA and the guidelines and USP and all this area has been evolving. But definitely, like generic impact, the biosimilar have a great impact. Of course, as an insurance company and others, you will look here over the next decade. They're going to actually make saving for the government, Medicaid, Medicare, and all this, close to $45 billion. And then we need to look for how the agreement on the regulatory for approval. And of course, pharma is being aware now. I showed you the approval which came in the US. It came from Big Pharma, from Novartis, from others, because they now realize that this is where the future is going to be heading. Let me take you to another changes in the business model. This is the drug approval over the year, which of course, I didn't go far enough to show you. The best approval, or the gold standard, was 1996, where there was 56 drug approved. But if you look recently, the drug approval has been going down, except in the last couple of years, they went up, and then they took a nosedive back last year in the 2016, and this year, they're expecting is also going to be low, maybe 18, 20 drugs. So the reasons for 2015, large number approved because the FDA have what we call the PDUFA. PDUFA, where you call it Pharmaceutical Prescription Drug User Act, where companies help the FDA to staff themselves. So instead of the drug application sit there for several years, they can review it quickly and so on. So some of the PDUFA things in 2015 were really pushed, was supposed to come in 2016. That's why the impact, of course, is good for patient, but led to nosedive in approval in 2016 and in 2017. So pharma, that's their revenue. So what they do, the pharma decided that we should look where we can get the drug from anywhere. So the anywheres mean they have to buy each other. Pharma went into feeding frenzy. You look here for one company becoming Pfizer took over Wyeth, they took over this, and then so this has been going on in the last 2 decades. And you can see here the merger and acquisition on that slide is amazing. I highlighted Pfizer because the company I worked was sold to Pfizer, so and so on. But look at the bottom line of these. What is the bottom line? The bottom line is losing jobs. So when you acquire a company and you have 2 plus 2 does not equal 4, 2 plus 2, and they say it will equal 2.5 or 3. So there's a lot of job lost, over 300 jobs lost, and these are the scientists who develop this innovative drug. If you look, when I started my career, there is this club called the Pharma Membership. There were about 42 members, and just in a decade or so, there are 11 of the major pharma with lots of jobs lost. And so pharma trying now to change their business model, and they realize, and that's where I'm going to talk to you in the last few slides, about they abandoned that they do everything themselves. They're going to go outside. They're going to collaborate, and now bring us to the conference here. They're going to do contract research. They're going to look for vendor and service provider because they realize that's source of productivity and also reducing the risk. And they don't have all what's needed to do it. So where they look at the obvious. They look at contract research and service provider for API and others. They look for biotech where they have a niche drug. Or they look for academic institution for innovation. So, and that's been working for them because they can acquire drug, which is really moving, and they can speed it up. Or some of the contract research manufacturing overseas. Many of them are from the laid-off scientists. So they actually have experience to do this kind of things. And for academic institution, we are not tied by profit. So we can have innovation, and we can take high risk, and all this. So pharma work on that. They just have to work the logistic with us. They have to work with the technology transfer. They look at the material transfer or confidentiality agreement and so on. That led to having drug discovery center in academia, same as he introduced me today. And I put some example here for you that many academic institutions start forming drug discovery center. And in order to do that, you really have to have support in your university. When I came 2008, I insisted with Temple University that we're going to have tenure track faculty like the regular faculty, not just appointment. We're going to have infrastructure. We're going to have all this. And that's very important to do the drug discovery. The centers, when you look at in the US, there's a lot of drug discovery now, centers worldwide, over 150 or 180. But some of them based on the founder expertise. If I'm a biologist working in neuroscience, that's the center. If I am doing cardiovascular, like in Albany, that's, so for us, we were different. We start with strength in medicinal chemistry, and we expanded, and we produced all the function needed to discover drug. That's where we started, and I'll share with you in a couple slides. And I have in the picture here, we call it the ribbon cutting. That was one lab. And I have in the picture here why we call it the Moulder Center. Because Lonnie Moulder and his wife Sharon, they were alumni, and they actually gave me starting money to do research. And that's when we started actually our process. We figured we're going to do drug discovery, and we're going to actually partner with pharma. We're going to work with the clinician to actually close the gap between preclinical. In the meantime, we do collaboration, which we do in collaboration overseas and here, and we're going to continue our academic mission, training the new generation, and so on. So what we did, we produced all these functions in medicinal chemistry, screening, biology, antibody, all this, and that's why we can do all the phases I explained to you in the first slides, from the early to optimize to get the candidate ready for development. We have all this function now. Now, after 8 years or so, the Moulder Center, now we have about 14 labs. We have over 20 actually faculty and staff. We brought in a lot of money to the university, which led the founder, or the Lonnie, he donated another $5 million endowment. So we have a lot of publication and presentation, and we have good projects in cancer and in other areas. We are flexible, interacting. We do like the academic work on getting grants. We also do contract research for some of the pharma. Some company will say, can you help us in the area of diabetes, which we did project for a Swedish company. In the meantime, we do even project management. Some people working with Indian company. So the Indian company said, help us when managing with these, which we do that. They support one of our staff, and we help them to progress in their projects. So let me just close and say, with some of the things we discussed today, that there is a lot of challenges for pharma. They try to address and continue with their innovation. And of course, indeed, that pharma try to put the best molecule forward, continuing with their innovation. And their business strategy has been changed, and they now focusing on what's coming in the future, personalized medicine and others. Let me say here what this is going to do to you or the patient and so on. Of course, insurance company are looking forward into how they're going to deal with personalized medicine. Is it the same like the generics and biosimilar and all this? And then, of course, company may not tackle rare disease. So some university and some other institute can do that part, and they maybe can get medicine and other therapeutics for these rare diseases. And then now, as I said, many companies focus on biologics, and that's the trend we're going to see in the future. With that, I thank you. I'm ready to take any question. Yes.
Thank you, Magid. Question about the challenges of partnering with between academia and industry, and what have you learned in your years at Temple?
Actually, I was just in a symposium last weekend at University of Pennsylvania where we were honoring my Ph.D. advisor, and that's exactly the topic. She was her 90th birthday, Professor Julia, and I talked to them about life after Big Pharma. So I have that comparison. It's really important when you look in academia and in industry, what the priorities are. Industry is a business. So what drives your innovation and everything is the profitability. So on the other side, in academia, we are really can tackle any project because science is really the motivation and the curiosity and so on. Then when you look at so many things in resources is tremendous. I mean, I had a group, 500 scientists. As I mentioned now, we are 20 people working in the center. So resources, but also there's a lot of fat in pharma because you do so many things, and for us, we have to be focused in academia. So we work in some certain projects, and we take them further, and some actually pharma and biotech. We just licensed one of the patent. And when I work at Temple, I encourage them for the intellectual property protection. So we filed in 8 years about 28 patents. And so these things is becoming one thing, awareness in academia. So in order for your science to be heading toward commercialization, nobody will touch it if you don't have intellectual property. So there's a lot of, and of course the politics in industry is the usual. In academia, it's more like Henry Kissinger said it, stakes are low, politics are fierce, politics of control. There's a lot of silo in academia. In pharma, you can't do that. It's all teamwork. So there's a lot of differences.
It's kind of funny, you mentioned intellectual property, and I was going to ask you a question. Doesn't this create somewhat of a minefield? I know in some states, the intellectual property is theirs, and is not easily transferred to industry.
Well, one thing you have to, and I have one of my colleagues here who's a patent agent can dwell on that, but let me tell you, I didn't put in my slides because of the time constraint. Don't forget in the 80s, there is the Bayh-Dole enactment where it said, if you discover things from federal resources, you cannot have exclusivity or so on. But after that, they said no, the company, the university, so the university's been going in research and they have incentivized research for researcher. University may get 50%, the inventor get. So now there is no state say anything discovered in the state belong to us, because this is against the federal government's actually laws which have been enacted in the 80s. You want to add to that?
So one of the things you have to keep in mind when you're looking to move for your technology from an academic setting into an industrial setting is patentability. And you really want to make sure that you have a good relationship with your tech transfer office, because they're the ones who really control how the licensing happens and whether or not those patents are pursued, right? As Magid said, you can have the best cure for cancer in the world in your academic research lab, but if it doesn't have patent protection against it, you're kind of stuck. It's not going to go anywhere. We've cultivated a very good relationship with our tech transfer office, and a lot of major universities that have these drug discovery centers have done the same kind of thing to enable this process. Some of the smaller universities, some of the ones that haven't really moved down this pathway, their tech transfer groups aren't quite as robust. Well, the laws are the same state to state. The U.S. patent laws are covered by federal jurisdiction, but within say Pennsylvania, I think it really varies within universities really, because if you try and work with, I know certain universities are much more difficult to work with because they demand more, right? Well, so any.
If there's federal funding, then the greater umbrella takes over in federal law.
Yes, that's correct. So federal law states that anything generated, any intellectual property generated by federal dollars must be can be exclusively licensed to someone, but the university has to give the inventors of record a portion of that proceeds. Prior to the Bayh-Dole Act, you could not exclusively license anything that was developed with federal dollars. It had to be non-exclusively licensed.
It's different from university to university, not state to state, because some university may take large portion. I remember I've been working with Temple many years ago before I started with Wyatt. It was 50% Temple, 50% inventors. Now, since Temple spend filing patents, they take 60%, and we just file 28 patents. And we get 40%, mean the inventor. So now every university have their incentive and patent policy. So you'll find University of Pennsylvania is different. I believe they are 75%, 25, I'm not sure what it is. But Temple is 60-40. So every university is different what they do in their commercialization and incentivization for their inventors. Because if you have different states, don't forget all the countries in the world, they signed what we call the TRIPS Treaty. And I remember the US gave some countries, including my own home in Egypt and Israel and Argentina and all these countries did not sign. They have up to year 2000, so they all signed because you don't want your drugs to go there. And of course, some countries may do it anyway, but then they sell it because they violate the patent. All these countries have to abide by patent protection.
Hey, Magid, very interesting talk. So I have a question. You mentioned about your center also serve as a project management to kind of an intermediary between CIO and biotech company. And most of the project management typically is done by the biotech or pharma themselves. So can you elaborate a little bit, what kind of model,
I'll tell you what we did. That's something was some of idea I thought about it, that I said to the company, I'm not going to say name now, was Indian company. I said to them, because I know the CEO, I said, we can help you and be with you on a conference call with your client. And we can actually, before the meeting, tell you what's needed and what you're missing and so on. So this company, where they have 6 chemists working with the client, then the year after, the client increased them to 12. So what the agreement was, that I have an experience in our center, we have ex-pharma. I mean, Ben Blast used to work at Wyeth, and I have other from AstraZeneca. And so they pay half the salary of one of the staff, because some of the staff, they are not faculty, so the university doesn't pay their salary, come from grants or from other things and so on. So they been with them and helped them, so that boosts their business. So that's the project management from our end.